I never imagined that a single mission could change my life forever. The morning started like any other, crisp air over the mountains of Albania, the hum of our transport plane cutting through the dawn. I was a medic, trained to save lives, not to take them, but on this day, survival itself would become my battlefield. I remember the chatter in the cabin, the nervous jokes of my fellow soldiers trying to shake off the tension, the smell of fuel and leather, the faint taste of anxiety on my tongue. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the Germans were close. We were deep behind enemy lines, and one misstep could mean death. Then, the first shots rang out. The staccato crack of anti-aircraft fire shattered the morning calm. Sparks of tracer rounds streaked across the sky like angry red lightning. I had barely time to register what was happening before the plane shuddered violently. The pilot yelled something I couldn't understand over the roar, and instinct kicked in. My hands moved automatically, checking straps, ensuring my pack wouldn't be lost on impact, gripping my fellow soldiers' arms as the plane pitched and twisted in the sky. There was no time for fear, only action. The crash was sudden and violent. The world erupted in a cacophony of metal tearing, screams, and fire. I was thrown forward, my head slamming against the seat in front, and then darkness briefly claimed me. When I came to, the plane was a smoldering ruin behind me, flames licking the edges of twisted metal, thick smoke curling into the sky. I pulled myself to my feet, every muscle screaming, my lungs filling with the acrid scent of burning fuel and cordite. I looked around and realized the full scope of my situation. I was alone, scattered from my unit, and completely unarmed. No rifle, no sidearm, nothing to defend myself if I was spotted by the enemy. Just me, my pack, and the will to survive. The forest loomed in front of me, thick with trees and undergrowth, a maze of shadows and muted colors. Every instinct told me to run, to disappear, to merge with the earth itself. I moved low and deliberate, pressing against the rough bark of trees, listening to the crackle of broken branches and distant enemy voices. German soldiers would be sweeping the area soon. I had no time to hesitate. I forced myself to move quickly, yet quietly, feeling every root and stone beneath my boots, every scrape and bruise a reminder of the fragility of life in these woods. Hunger was immediate. My pack had been partially destroyed in the crash. I scavenged what I could, handfuls of berries, roots, anything that wouldn't poison me. Even finding water was a calculated risk. Streams ran clear, cold, life-giving, but approaching them meant exposure. Every step, every decision became a gamble with death. Sleep was scarce. Even a moment of rest could give the enemy a chance to find me. At night, I would curl into the underbrush, shivering beneath my torn coat, listening to the rustle of leaves, the snap of distant twigs, the faint echo of gunfire in the hills. Each sound was a potential threat, a constant reminder that I was in enemy territory. By the third day, I began to understand the forest not just as a hiding place, but as an ally. I learned to move with the wind, to blend with shadows, to anticipate patrol routes based on subtle clues, footprints in the mud, discarded wrappers, smoke drifting from a distant fire. I started improvising traps, not to kill, but to mislead and delay the enemy, giving me a margin of safety. Every meal, every sip of water, every step forward was hard-earned. I had no weapon. I relied entirely on cunning, stealth, and sheer patience. The psychological toll was relentless. Hunger gnawed at me. Fatigue clouded my mind. Fear was a constant companion, whispering that I wouldn't make it another day. But giving in to fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. I reminded myself of my training, my duty as a medic, and the hope that somehow someone would find me, or I would find my way back to safety. Every heartbeat, every breath, every careful movement was a small victory over the wilderness and the enemy alike. On the fifth day, I realized the forest had become an extension of myself. I could read the trees, the undergrowth, the sounds of animals, all as signs of the enemy's presence or absence. The Germans were methodical, but I had patience and invisibility on my side. I became a ghost in their world, unseen and unheard, surviving on wits alone. Each day was a test of endurance, intelligence, and nerve. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but each successful day strengthened my resolve. And yet, amid the fear, the hunger, and the constant threat of discovery, I felt a strange clarity. Life had been reduced to its rawest form: observation, decision, and action. Every step I took, every choice I made, determined whether I would live or die. I had no weapon, no reinforcements, no certainty. Only the forest, my instincts, and the unyielding will to survive. I pressed onward, deeper into the mountains, knowing that every day I survived brought me closer to freedom and further from the life I had known before the crash. Behind enemy lines, alone and unarmed, every heartbeat was a battle, and I was determined to win. The forest had grown quieter, unnervingly so. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Not peace, but the calm before something bad. By the sixth day, I'd learned to read the forest's rhythm. Birds went silent when danger crept near, and that morning the woods were dead still. I crouched low behind a moss-covered log, feeling the cold dampness seep through my uniform. My heartbeat sounded too loud in my ears. I could almost swear the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then I heard it. The faint crunch of boots, slow, deliberate, heavy steps crushing dead leaves underfoot. My blood froze. German voices followed, muffled but unmistakable, moving in a tight pattern. They were searching for me. I pressed myself against the ground, my face buried in dirt and leaves, barely daring to breathe. Through a gap between roots, I saw them. 4 soldiers, rifles ready, scanning the forest floor. One of them carried a dog on a leash, its nose pressed to the earth, sniffing. My pulse quickened. A dog meant trouble. I was downwind, but all it would take was one shift in the breeze and they'd have me. I reached slowly into my pack and pulled out a scrap of fabric I'd taken from the wreckage. It was soaked with the engine oil from the crash. Foul stuff, but strong enough to mask scent. I rubbed it on my sleeves, on my boots, even on my hair, praying it would confuse the animal. The dog stopped, sniffed the air, and whined softly. The handler tugged at its leash and muttered something, irritated. The soldiers moved on, their boots crunching away into the distance. I didn't move for another 20 minutes. My muscles cramped, my chest ached, but I stayed perfectly still. I had learned that in war, patience could be the difference between life and death. When I finally crawled out from my hiding place, the forest seemed alive again. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant murmur of a stream. I took it as a sign. I followed the stream, keeping low, moving parallel to the water, but never too close. Streams were lifelines for soldiers. They provided water, but also betrayed movement. Still, I needed to drink. I cupped cold water in my hands, savoring it like it was fine whiskey. By the 8th day, I was running on instinct alone. My stomach was a hollow drum. I'd eaten what berries I could identify, but my strength was fading. My boots were splitting, my uniform ragged, my beard a tangle of grime and exhaustion. My only comfort was the knowledge that I was still breathing, still one step ahead of the Germans. Every time I thought I couldn't go on, I'd hear the distant rumble of trucks or the faint echo of shouts, and that fear would drive me forward. That night, I stumbled upon an old stone shepherd's hut, half buried in the hillside. The roof had caved in on one side, but the other offered shelter. I crawled inside, pushing aside cobwebs and dust. For the first time in days, I felt something close to safety. There was no firewood, no food, Nothing but a rotting straw mat and silence. I wrapped myself in my coat and slept, too exhausted to dream. I woke before dawn to movement outside. My heart jumped. Footsteps again. But these were different, lighter. I peered through a crack in the wall and saw a man. An old Albanian shepherd, his face weathered, eyes sharp. He carried no weapon, only a crook and a small sack. I hesitated. Any noise could draw attention, but any chance of help was worth the risk. I whispered, "Friend?" The old man froze, his head snapping toward the hut. His eyes narrowed. For a moment, I thought he might shout or run. But then he stepped closer, peered in, and his expression softened. Maybe it was the uniform or the exhaustion written all over me, but he seemed to understand. He spoke a few words in Albanian, which I didn't catch, but his tone was kind. He reached into his sack and handed me a piece of bread, rough and stale, but it might as well have been gold. I devoured it like a starving animal. He motioned for me to stay quiet, then pointed toward the valley where faint columns of smoke marked German encampments. He mimed soldiers walking, then shook his head and pointed toward the mountains. I understood. Danger below, safety above. I nodded and he smiled faintly before vanishing into the mist like a ghost. That simple act, a stranger risking his life to help me, gave me something I hadn't felt since the crash. Hope. Maybe I wasn't entirely alone out here. Maybe humanity still existed, even in a world torn apart by war. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain grew harsher, but the air felt cleaner, freer. Snow still clung to the peaks, melting into streams that fed the valleys below. The higher I went, the harder it became to move, but the safer I felt. The Germans rarely ventured this far without vehicles, and their engines couldn't follow me where only goats could walk. That night, as I watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, I thought about home, about my parents in Virginia, about the life I'd left behind, about the absurdity of it all. I was a medic, trained to heal, not to hide like an animal in foreign woods. Yet here I was, alive, unarmed, hunted, but unbroken. And for the first time since the crash, I allowed myself to believe maybe I could make it home. By the 9th day, I'd stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like prey. The forest had become a living, breathing entity around me. It whispered, it warned, it sheltered. Every sense was heightened to a level I didn't know possible. I could smell smoke miles away, hear the faint crunch of boots on damp soil, and feel danger before it appeared. Survival had stripped everything unnecessary away. I no longer thought about medals or missions. I thought about water, warmth, concealment, and the next sunrise. The shepherd's directions had saved my life. Moving toward the higher slopes meant colder nights, but it also meant fewer patrols. Germans preferred the valleys and roads. Their vehicles couldn't climb the steep trails like goats and ghosts could. I followed those hidden paths, weaving through crags and forests, each step a gamble. Sometimes I'd find the remnants of other lives, an old campsite, a rusted tin, even a torn piece of cloth snagged on a branch. Signs that others had passed through, maybe other soldiers, maybe villagers. Each trace reminded me I wasn't the first to be hunted in these hills. On the 10th day, I saw them again. 3 German soldiers, moving in a tight formation along a ridge below me. They were tired, muttering to each other, rifles slung loosely but still alert. I froze behind a rock outcropping, heart hammering in my chest. I had 2 choices, hide and hope they passed, or distract them and slip away unnoticed. Hiding worked until it didn't. And if they found the tracks I'd left, I'd be done. I remembered something my survival instructor once said. If you can't fight your enemy, fool him. So that's what I did. I found a narrow stream that wound downhill and dipped a rag in it, tying it to a stick. Then I crawled along a side path, dragging the wet rag behind me to erase my footprints. I dropped it into the stream, letting the current carry it away. The scent would lead their dog downstream, far from me. I heard shouts minutes later. The bark of a dog, the rustle of pursuit. My trap worked. While they followed the false trail and I moved uphill, fast and silent. By nightfall, I had gained several miles. Exhaustion gnawed at my bones, but I didn't dare stop until the stars were fully out. I found shelter in a shallow cave hidden by thorn bushes. My breath came in sharp bursts, my hands trembling from hunger and cold. I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, but I didn't care. I had outwitted them. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a faint smile. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain, gentle at first, then pounding. It was both a blessing and a curse. The rain washed away tracks, making it nearly impossible for anyone to follow me. But it also soaked everything I had. My boots squelched, my coat clung to me like a second skin, and the cold bit deep. Still, I moved. Stopping meant dying. By midday, I found an abandoned barn, barely standing, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Inside, I found the remnants of hay and, miracle of miracles, a rusted tin of beans. I pried it open with a rock, cutting my hand in the process, but I didn't care. The food tasted like heaven, metallic and gritty, but it filled my stomach for the first time in days. As I sat there, I thought about the men who had been searching for me. I imagined their frustration when they realized I'd vanished, the dog barking at an empty stream. It wasn't victory, it was survival, pure and simple. I didn't hate them. They were soldiers, doing what they were told, just like I had been. War didn't care about sides, it just consumed. That night I lit no fire. I'd learned that light, even the faintest flicker, could betray you. Instead, I wrapped myself in straw and listened to the rain beating on the roof. My thoughts wandered to the crash, the screams, the heat, the faces of the men who hadn't made it. Their ghosts lingered with me, silent companions in the dark. I whispered their names, promising I'd make it home for them, if not for myself. On the 11th day, I saw the first sign of hope. Distant smoke, not from soldiers, but from what looked like a village. My first instinct was caution. Villages could mean food and warmth, or betrayal. The Germans often forced locals to turn in any Allied soldiers they found. But I was at my limit. If I didn't find help soon, the forest would finish what the enemy started. As I crept closer, I saw figures moving, women drawing water, a child chasing a goat, men hauling wood, no soldiers. I watched from a ridge for hours, studying every movement, every gesture. The villagers looked poor, worn down by war, but not hostile. I decided to risk it. I waited until dusk, then approached quietly, hands raised. A boy saw me first, eyes wide, then sprinted toward a house, shouting in Albanian. I froze, expecting armed men to emerge. Instead, an older man came out, the same shepherd who had helped me days before. He looked shocked, then smiled. The kind of smile that feels like sunlight after weeks of darkness. He motioned me inside, to a small room lit by a single candle. His wife brought bread and cheese, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I ate like a human being, not an animal. I couldn't speak their language, but gratitude doesn't need words. I bowed my head, and the old man placed a hand on my shoulder. His eyes said what I couldn't. You're safe. For now. That night, as the storm raged outside and I finally slept on a real bed of straw, I realized something profound. Survival wasn't just about cunning or endurance. It was about mercy. The rare, fragile kind that still existed in the hearts of strangers, even in a world at war. And that mercy would be the reason I lived to see another dawn. The warmth of that tiny room almost broke me. After 11 days of damp earth, cold wind, and fear, the simple crackle of a fire felt like heaven itself. My hands trembled as the old man's wife pressed a bowl of broth into them. Steam rose in ribbons, filling my lungs with something that wasn't just warmth. It was life. I'd forgotten what it felt like to eat without fear, to close my eyes without expecting a gunshot. The family didn't ask many questions. Maybe they already knew what I was. My uniform was long gone, replaced by rags and mud, but my accent, my face, my trembling gratitude, they told them enough. The old man, Beckham, was cautious. He spoke in quiet tones to his wife, glancing at the window every few minutes. Even in their own home, fear was a constant guest. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with mist. Beckham led me to the back of his barn, where he'd hidden me beneath stacks of hay. Soldaten, he whispered, his hand making a marching motion. I understood. Patrols. The Germans were near again. From my hiding spot, I could hear everything. Boots on mud. The guttural shouts of men giving orders. A truck engine sputtering somewhere close. The familiar dread settled into my stomach. I clutched a broken piece of wood like it was a weapon, ready to fight even though I knew it was useless. For nearly 2 hours, the sound of occupation filled the air. Dogs barking, the crack of rifles being checked, the occasional curse in German. Then silence. When Beckham finally lifted the hay and nodded for me to come out, his face was pale. You go, he said softly, pointing toward the hills. Soon. He fed me one last time before I left. His wife pressed something into my hand. A small wooden cross, carved roughly but with care. I wasn't a religious man, but I closed my fingers around it like it was a lifeline. Zoti te ruajd, she whispered. God protect you. I slipped out at dusk, keeping to the shadows. The villagers had risked everything by sheltering me. If the Germans learned what they had done, they'd burn the whole place to the ground. That thought burned hotter in me than any hunger or cold. I couldn't let that happen. The forest welcomed me back like an old friend. Every branch, every shadow felt familiar now. I moved differently, quieter, more confident. I wasn't just running anymore. I was navigating. I knew the land's language, its rhythms. The wind carried warnings. The bird's silence meant movement. By the 12th day, I reached the ruins of an old monastery high in the hills. Its roof had collapsed, and vines crawled through broken stone, but it was shelter. I built a small nest of hay and fabric scraps and slept for nearly a full day. My body needed it. When I woke, I could hear gunfire far to the west, faint, rhythmic, like thunder. The war was still raging, and I was still lost in its shadow. I scavenged what I could from the ruins, a rusted tin cup, some candle wax, an old book with pages torn and yellowed. The words meant nothing to me, but I kept it anyway. Something about holding a book, even when I couldn't read, made me feel human again. That night, I made a small fire, deep within the monastery's stone walls. I knew it was risky, but I needed the warmth. As I sat there, the flames dancing over broken saints and faded murals, I thought about the crash again. I saw the faces of my crew. Miller, who never stopped cracking jokes, Davis, who swore he'd open a diner after the war, and Jackson, our pilot, who'd kept control of the plane right until the end. I wondered if anyone even knew what had happened to us. Sometime after midnight, I heard voices outside, low, harsh, and close. I doused the fire and pressed myself against the wall. 3 men speaking German, their words echoing faintly. I caught fragments. Amerikaner, Wald, Feinden. They were looking for me. My heartbeat pounded so loud I thought they'd hear it. One of them stepped inside the ruins, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. The beam swept across the floor, inches from where I crouched. I held my breath. A drop of sweat slid down my temple, then a crash. Somewhere outside, a fox had knocked over a fallen beam. The soldier turned, shouted something to his comrades, and they moved off toward the noise. I didn't breathe again until the sound of their boots faded completely. When morning came, I was gone. I left the monastery before dawn, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew colder, the world quieter. I found a cave halfway up a ridge and built a makeshift shelter inside. From there, I could see the valley, the smoke from villages, the movement of troops. It felt like watching a play I could never step into again. I was still alive. That fact alone felt impossible. But each sunrise that brought new danger, and the promise that my luck couldn't last forever. I had no map, no weapon, no clear path to safety. Only instinct and the faint hope that somewhere, beyond these mountains, someone still remembered we were out here, 17 days behind enemy lines. And I was only on day 13. By the 13th day, hunger had become something alive inside me, a creature gnawing at my insides, whispering promises I couldn't fulfill. My ribs showed through my shirt, and every step sent a dull ache up my legs. I'd survived on scraps, a few berries, rainwater, and the last of the beans from that barn, but my strength was slipping. The cold didn't just bite anymore. It dug its teeth in and held on. The mountains stretched endlessly around me, beautiful and cruel. Each morning I woke to a frost-covered world, the trees glittering like glass, the ground hard beneath me. My breath rose in pale clouds, proof that I was still alive, even if I barely felt it. I'd stopped thinking about rescue. Hope was too dangerous a thing to hold on to out here. Instead, I thought in terms of hours, where to hide until dusk, where to find water, how to avoid the next patrol. Life had become a pattern of small victories, each one bought with fear. Around noon, I stumbled upon a goat trail that wound down into a narrow ravine. My body wanted to collapse, but my instincts told me to follow it. Animals knew where water was. Sure enough, half a mile later, I found a shallow stream trickling between the rocks. I drank until I was sick, then drank more. The water brought a kind of clarity. For the first time in days, I took stock of myself. The torn sleeves, the boots split at the seams, the stench of sweat and dirt. My beard had grown wild, my skin cut and bruised. I barely recognized the man reflected in the stream. He looked like a ghost, wearing the remnants of a uniform. Maybe that's what I'd become. A ghost haunting a war that hadn't finished with him. That afternoon I found signs of movement, boot prints in the mud, fresh ones. I froze, crouching low, my heart hammering. The prints led uphill, large, heavy, spaced evenly. Soldiers. I couldn't tell if they were German or local militia, but I knew one thing. If they were hunting, I was the prey. I doubled back, stepping only on stone and roots, wiping my tracks with branches. Every sound felt amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf, even the beating of my own heart. I moved like a shadow, low and silent, until I reached a rocky slope that offered a clear view of the valley below. That's when I saw them. A patrol of 5 Germans, maybe 6, spreading out in a line. One of them had a dog. My stomach clenched. I'd escaped them once. I might not get a second chance. I slid behind a boulder and pressed myself flat, barely daring to breathe. The dog stopped suddenly, nose twitching. Its handler muttered something and yanked the leash. My pulse pounded in my ears. They were close, too close. A shift in the wind saved me. The smell of the stream must have carried down because the dog turned, tugging its handler in the opposite direction. The men followed, cursing and stumbling through the brush. I stayed still for nearly an hour after they'd gone, waiting for the world to move again. When I finally stood, my legs felt like lead. I climbed higher into the ridge, my body moving more from instinct than strength. I had learned that fear could keep a man alive long after reason said he should be dead. As the sun dipped low, painting the peaks in fire and shadow, I found another cave, smaller than the last, but hidden deep behind a curtain of vines. I crawled inside and collapsed. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was cold, hungry, and utterly alone. That night the dreams came. I saw the crash again, the plane burning, Miller's voice shouting my name, Davis trapped under twisted metal. I tried to pull him free, but the fire swallowed him, and I woke to my own scream echoing off the cave walls. Sweat drenched my face. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The forest was silent outside, too silent. Then came the sound, faint at first, then clearer. Boots on rock. A search party. They were back. I crawled to the mouth of the cave and peered through the vines. Lanterns bobbed in the dark below, their yellow light cutting through the trees. I counted 3, maybe 4 men. They were speaking German. One laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed up the slope. They were close enough that I could see the gleam of their helmets. I pressed myself deeper into the cave, forcing my breath into slow, silent patterns. The soldiers stopped 100 feet below. One pointed up toward the ridge. My heart stopped. Then, a sound I didn't expect. Thunder. The sky flashed white and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Within minutes, the mountainside was shrouded in mist. The soldiers cursed, their voices fading as they retreated downhill. I waited hours before I dared to move again. When I finally stepped out into the rain, I tilted my head back and let it wash over me. It was cold, almost unbearable. But it felt like a baptism, a cleansing. I was still alive. That night I huddled against the stone wall of the cave, clutching the little wooden cross the shepherd's wife had given me. I wasn't sure if I believed in God, but I believed in something. Fate, luck, mercy, whatever it was that had kept me breathing this long. And as lightning flashed across the sky, I made myself a promise. If I ever made it out of these mountains alive, I'd never waste another second of the life I'd been given. But for now, I had 4 more days to survive, and the Germans were still hunting. By day 14, the forest had stopped being my ally and started whispering against me. Every sound became a question, every shadow a threat. Hunger does that to a man. It blurs the line between real and imagined until even your own heartbeat sounds like footsteps following you. My body was barely functioning. I'd gone 2 days without food, and water alone couldn't hold me together anymore. My hands shook constantly. My vision blurred in and out like an old film reel catching on itself. But it wasn't just my body that was breaking, it was my mind. I started talking to people who weren't there. Miller, Davis, even the shepherd from the village. I could hear their voices in the rustle of leaves, see their shapes in the mist. They'd tell me to move, to rest, to eat. Sometimes I'd argue back, but every time I blinked, the ghosts were gone, leaving me alone again with the silence. I needed food, anything. I remembered seeing traps once, simple snares made of wire and branch loops. I had no wire, but I tore strips from my coat and set crude traps near a cluster of bushes. It was pathetic, but it gave me something to do, something to hope for. Hours passed. Nothing. My traps hung empty, swaying in the wind. Desperation made me reckless. I started turning over stones, looking for insects, grubs, anything alive. I ate them without thinking. The taste was bitter and wrong, but I didn't care. As night fell, I crawled back to my cave, weaker than ever, my stomach cramped from what I'd eaten, and my head felt like it was splitting open. I lay there in the dark, shivering, my breath shallow. I must have drifted off because I woke to voices, real ones, German again, close. I crawled to the entrance and peered through the vines. 2 soldiers, no more than 50 feet away, moving with flashlights. They were checking the cliffs, their rifles ready. I could see the insignia on their sleeves. They weren't random patrols, they were trackers. One of them said something I couldn't catch. The other laughed. Low, cruel. He pointed toward the slope leading to my cave. I froze. Then I saw movement, something small darting out of the brush, a hare. The soldiers fired instantly, bullets cracking the air. The hare fell limp. They laughed again, retrieving their prize. My entire body shook from adrenaline, but they hadn't seen me. Not yet. They sat down near the fire they built and cooked the animal right there, the smell of burning meat flooding the air. I watched, half in terror, half in agony. My hunger clawed at me. The scent drove me mad. I don't remember deciding to move. I just remember crawling. slowly, silently, inch by inch, down the rocks toward them. My mind wasn't my own anymore. Hunger had taken command. I wasn't thinking about risk or capture. I was thinking about survival. Then one of them turned his head. Our eyes met. Time stopped. He shouted, and I bolted. Rocks tore at my hands as I scrambled up the ridge. Bullets tore through the night, cracking past my ears. I threw myself behind a fallen log and rolled downhill into darkness. I ran. I don't know how long, maybe minutes, maybe hours. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but fear gave me strength hunger couldn't. I didn't stop until the only sound left was rain dripping through the trees. When I finally collapsed, I found myself in a gully, a deep scar in the mountain carved by old storms. The air smelled of wet earth. I lay there gasping, rain soaking through my clothes, blood running from my knees and palms. My body was done. But I was alive. Again, somehow. As dawn broke, I dragged myself out of the gully and found a patch of sunlight breaking through the clouds. I sat there, shaking uncontrollably, staring at my hands. They didn't feel like mine anymore. They were just tools of instinct, doing what they had to do. That's when I found it. A rusted mess tin half buried in the dirt. Probably dropped by a soldier weeks ago. Inside was a handful of rice grains, stuck together from moisture. I ate every last one, licking the tin clean. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me I wasn't dead yet. Later that day, I heard distant gunfire again. Different this time. Short bursts, closer than before. I climbed to a ridge to see what was happening. Smoke was rising from the valley below, and I could hear shouting. Through the haze, I saw a group of men, not Germans. Their uniforms were ragged, mismatched, partisans. For the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something like hope, real hope. But I didn't move. Not yet. Hope could be a trap as easily as any snare. That night I lay awake, watching the stars through the cracks in the trees. I thought of home, of wide Texas fields, of my mother's voice, of laughter that didn't echo off stone. Those memories kept me alive as much as any food or fire. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd go down the mountain, toward the gunfire, toward the chance, however small, that someone down there wasn't my enemy. But as I closed my eyes, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sure I remembered how to be around people anymore. 17 days behind enemy lines, and I was beginning to understand why ghosts never come back the same. By the morning of the 15th day, I could barely feel my legs. My body had become a collection of aches and shivers, but something deeper was keeping me upright. The faint hope that those men I'd seen weren't Germans. I didn't know much about the Albanian resistance, but rumors had reached us before the crash. They were fierce fighters, mountain-born and impossible to break. I started down the slope, careful to move between trees and rocks. The terrain was cruel, loose stone, sharp thorns, every step a fight. But the closer I got, the louder the echoes became, shouts, gunfire, the bark of rifles. The air smelled of smoke and iron. By midday, I was close enough to see movement through the trees, men, a dozen of them, maybe more, moving fast, ducking behind walls and tree trunks. Their clothes were a patchwork of uniforms and civilian rags, their weapons mismatched. They looked like chaos, but there was precision in their movements. These weren't villagers defending their homes. These were partisans. I knew stepping out could get me killed. To them, I could just as easily be a German spy as a lost Allied airman. But I couldn't stay hidden forever. My mind was torn between instinct and desperation, hide or trust. Then I made my choice. I tore a strip of white cloth from my sleeve and tied it to a stick. A crude flag, but it was all I had. Then I stood, slowly, every nerve in my body screaming, and called out, "American! I'm American!" The effect was instant. Guns turned toward me. I froze, hands raised. Someone shouted something in Albanian, sharp and commanding. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew the tone, stay where you are. A man broke from the group and approached, his rifle steady, eyes narrow. He wore a Soviet-style cap and a thick beard. When he spoke, his English was broken but clear. Who are you? Sergeant Harold Hayes, U.S. Army Air Corps, I said. My plane crashed. I've been alone 17 days. He studied me. The torn clothes, the mud, the hollow eyes. Then he lowered his rifle. American, he repeated softly, almost to himself. Come. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. Two men rushed forward and caught me under the arms. I didn't resist. My body was done fighting. They led me to a small stone hut tucked into the hillside. Inside, it was warm. A fire, blankets, the smell of soup. They sat me down, speaking rapidly to one another. The leader introduced himself as Arbin, commander of a small partisan cell operating in the region. We saw the Germans searching the forest, he said. They look for you, yes? I nodded. They've been close. Too close. He grinned, a sharp, wolfish expression. Then you lucky man. Most men Germans look for... They find. His words carried no malice, just fact. I managed a weak smile. One of his men, a young fighter barely out of his teens, handed me a bowl. Soup. Thin, but hot. I drank it greedily, not caring that it burned my mouth. It tasted like victory. As I ate, Arbin studied me. You have no weapon? I shook my head. Lost everything in the crash. He leaned back, thoughtful. Still alive, no gun, no map. You walk mountains 17 days. He laughed softly. Maybe God likes you, American. Maybe he's just testing me, I said, voice hoarse. The men around the fire chuckled, but I could see the respect in their eyes. Survival, especially in those mountains, earned its own kind of honor. They gave me a place to rest in the back of the hut, on a bed of straw and blankets. I must have slept for a full day, maybe more. When I woke, Arbin was there, cleaning his rifle. He looked up and said, You sleep like dead man. Feels about right, I muttered. He chuckled, then handed me a piece of bread. Eat. Then you tell me what happened. And so I did. I told him about the crash, the fire, the chase, the shepherd, the patrols, every desperate, haunted detail. When I finished, Arbin nodded slowly. You walk good path. Smart, lucky. Then his expression darkened. But Germans still search. They know American alive. You stay. They come here. We die. The words hit hard. I couldn't bring death to these people, not after everything they'd done for me. Then I'll move on, I said quietly. I'll find another way. Arbin shook his head. No. You are one of us now. We hide you, then send message. British and South, they take you. For the first time, there was a glimmer of something real in the darkness. A way home. That night I sat by the fire with the partisans. They sang softly, low, mournful songs about lost brothers and burned villages. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the feeling. We were all ghosts of the same war. Arbin handed me a small pistol. You say no weapon. Now you have one. I took it, the weight unfamiliar after so long. I hope I don't need it, I said. He nodded. No man hopes for war, but war comes anyway. As I lay down to sleep, the wind howled outside, carrying with it the distant echo of artillery. I realized I wasn't alone anymore, but that didn't mean I was safe. The Germans wouldn't stop until they were sure I was dead. And if they found this camp, they wouldn't just take me, they'd burn the whole mountain. I closed my eyes, the pistol resting beside me. For the first time in 17 days, I wasn't just surviving. I was waiting for what came next. And in war, waiting could be the most dangerous thing of all. Sleep never lasted long in those mountains. Even in safety, the war had a way of creeping into your dreams. That night, I dreamed of engines, the roar of our bomber going down, the flash of flak bursts, the feeling of being torn from the sky. When I woke, the fire was low and Arbin was gone. Outside, the air was still, too still. In war, silence was never peace. It was warning. I stepped out of the hut, pulling my coat tight against the cold. The morning mist clung to the trees, rolling over the slopes like smoke. A few partisans were crouched by a rock, scanning the valley below through a pair of captured German binoculars. One of them turned, his expression grim. "Germans," he muttered. I followed his gaze. In the distance, I could just make out the faint shimmer of movement, helmets glinting in the morning light. Lines of men spreading out methodically, moving up the mountain. "Patrol?" I asked. Arbin appeared beside me, his face hard. "Not patrol, hunt." He didn't need to say for who. The Germans had found our trail. Within minutes, the camp erupted into motion. Blankets were rolled, weapons checked, packs strapped tight. There was no panic, just grim efficiency. These men had done this before. They knew what came next. I grabbed what little I had, the pistol Arbin had given me, a canteen, and a torn scrap of bread. As I slung the strap over my shoulder, Arbin barked orders in Albanian, his voice sharp but calm. Then he turned to me. "We move north," he said. "There are caves. We hide until dark." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. My body still hadn't recovered from the days of starvation. But fear has a way of giving strength where food cannot. We began the climb, the sound of boots crunching on rock and brush. The mountain air grew thin and sharp, the mist curling around us like ghosts. Every now and then, the crack of rifle fire echoed from below, distant but too close for comfort. The partisans moved like shadows, disappearing between trees and rocks. I tried to keep up, every muscle screaming. Arbin stayed close to me, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. "If they see us," he muttered, "run for the caves. Do not stop." By midday, we reached a narrow pass. Beyond it lay a ravine, deep, filled with twisted pines and broken stone. Arbin signaled for silence. We crouched behind a fallen tree, listening. That's when I heard it. The mechanical growl of engines. Not truck, not jeeps. Tanks. The sound rolled through the valley, heavy and relentless. German half-tracks, maybe a panzer or two, grinding their way up the slope. The air vibrated with it. "They bring armor," one of the partisans whispered. Arbin's jaw tightened. "They burn everything they cannot find." He looked at me then, eyes fierce. "You go with Petro," he said, pointing to a young fighter beside him. "He'd take you to cave, I stay." "No," I said immediately. "If they're coming, you'll need everyone you've got." He shook his head. "You are not one of my men. You are mission. If you die, nothing changes. If you live, you tell the world what happens here." Before I could argue, he gripped my shoulder. "Go, Harold." The sound of gunfire cut through the valley, sharp and close. Someone shouted from below, then another voice, and then chaos. "Go," Arbin barked, pushing me toward Petro. We ran. Branches whipped against my face as we tore through the trees. Behind us, the mountain exploded with noise. Rifles, machine guns, shouting in German and Albanian. The forest echoed with it, the sound bouncing off the rock walls like thunder. We reached a narrow trail that wound upward between jagged cliffs. The climb was brutal. My lungs burned, my vision swam, but I didn't stop. Petro led the way, moving like a goat over the rocks. When we finally reached the cave, I collapsed just inside, gasping for air. Petro crouched at the entrance, peering out with his rifle ready. Below, the forest burned. Smoke rose between the trees, black and thick. I could see flashes of light. Explosions, muzzle fire. The Germans were torching everything, leaving nothing alive. Petro didn't look away. "Arbin fight," he said quietly. "He not run." I clenched my fists, helpless. Every instinct told me to go back, to help. But what could I do? I was half dead, unarmed, and barely standing. The battle raged for hours. The mountains turned into a furnace of smoke and gunfire. Every now and then we'd hear shouts echoing up the slopes, and then silence. By nightfall, it was over. The fires below glowed like dying stars. The Germans had moved on, leaving behind only ashes. Petro lowered his rifle, his face pale in the flickering light. "We go down tomorrow," he said. "Find who live." I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the cave mouth, staring at the smoke curling into the black sky. I'd spent 17 days fighting to survive. Now I realized, survival wasn't just about me anymore. It was about remembering. Because men like Arbin, men who stood and fought when they could have run, they deserved to be remembered. And if I made it out of those mountains alive, I swore I'd make sure the world knew their names. When dawn finally broke, the mountain was quiet again, too quiet. The gunfire had stopped, the shouting had died, and the only sound left was the whisper of the wind through the burned trees. Petra and I waited until the light grew strong enough to see the valley below. What had been a forest the day before was now a scar. Blackened trunks, smoldering ash, the faint metallic glint of shell casings scattered like seeds across the earth. Petro stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "We go now," he said simply. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. For men like him, grief had to wait. Survival came first. The descent was harder than the climb. The ground was slick with ash and loose stone, and every step stirred up ghosts of smoke. As we moved aside, the smell hit me. That unmistakable stench of burned flesh and gunpowder. It made my stomach twist. Halfway down, we found the first body. A partisan, face down, a rifle still clutched in his hand. Petro knelt beside him, turning him over gently. He didn't say a word, just closed the man's eyes, crossed himself, and kept walking. There were more as we went. Men I'd seen laughing by the fire just a day before. I recognized one, the young fighter who'd given me soup when I first arrived. His cap was gone, and a bullet hole marked the center of his chest. I stopped beside him, unsure what to do. Petro rested a hand on my shoulder. "Arbin say always," he murmured. "Every man who fight here die for mountain. Mountain, remember." It wasn't much comfort, but maybe it was enough. By the time we reached what had been the camp, the sun was high. The huts were gone, just charred frames and scattered debris. The fire had eaten everything. But as we picked through the wreckage, I heard something, faint, rhythmic. A cough. Petro froze. "Someone live." We followed the sound to a shallow ditch behind a rock wall. There, half buried under branches, was a man. His face was blackened with soot, his arm twisted at a strange angle, but he was breathing. "Arbin," Petro whispered. I dropped to my knees beside him. He looked terrible. Blood caked across his temple. One leg burned badly. But when his eyes flickered open, that familiar, sharp smile was still there. "American," he rasped. "Still alive, eh?" "Because of you?" I said, choking back the lump in my throat. He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. "Good. Then not all for nothing." Petro tore a strip from his shirt and began cleaning Arbin's wounds as best he could. I gave him water from my canteen, the last I had. Arbin drank slowly, then motioned for me to come closer. "Listen," he said weakly. "The Germans go east. They think we all dead, but they leave patrols, roadblocked. You cannot go down valley." "Then what do we do?" He looked at Petro. "North," he said. "Through the high pass. 3 days' walk. There's British camp near the coast. They send radio. They help you. Come with us." I said. Arbin smiled faintly. "No. My legs say no. My fight here is finished." I shook my head. "We can carry you." He stopped me with a glance. "You waste your strength. I die here. You live. That is the trade." Petro's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He knew. I stayed with Arbin until his breathing slowed. He didn't cry out. He didn't beg. He just stared out at the sky, that endless blue above the smoke, and whispered something in Albanian, a prayer maybe. Then he was gone. We buried him there beneath the stones. No cross, no flag, just a mound of earth on a burned mountain. When it was done, Petro stood silent for a long time. Then he said, "We go now, before Germans come again." We gathered what we could, a few cartridges, some dry rations that had miraculously survived the fire, and a single map, half burned but showing enough to guide us north. The journey that followed was hell. The terrain grew harsher, the air colder. At night, we slept in hollows beneath the rocks, too afraid to light fires. During the day, we moved fast, hugging shadows, avoiding roads. Twice, we saw German patrols, trucks moving slowly along the ridges, soldiers scanning the slopes with binoculars. Once, we heard dogs. Petro motioned for silence, pressing a finger to his lips. We lay flat under a fallen log, hearts pounding, as two soldiers passed less than 20 feet away. Their boots crunched on the frost. I held my breath until the sound faded. That night, Petro spoke little, but as we sat under the stars, he handed me a small object, a silver medallion, worn and scratched. "Arbens," he said. "You keep. You tell people who he was." I took it carefully, the metal cold in my hand. "I will," I said. "I swear it." He nodded once, then looked out toward the dark horizon. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we cross the pass. If we live, we see your people." And as I stared out into that frozen wilderness, the endless sweep of ridges and valleys, the smoke still rising in the distance, I realized something. 17 days had taught me how to survive, but now I was learning how to carry the weight of those who didn't. The mountains had always been our shield, steep, wild, and impossible to tame. But now, as Petro and I climbed toward the high pass Arben had spoken of, they felt more like a trial, a test of how much a man could endure before he broke. We left before dawn, moving in silence. The sky was gray, heavy with snow that hadn't yet fallen. My boots were torn at the seams, my uniform little more than rags. Every step up the rocky slope sent knives of pain through my legs, but I pushed on. I had to. Arben's words echoed in my head. "You live. That is the trade." The air thinned quickly as we climbed. Each breath burned and the wind cut like glass. Petro moved ahead, steady as ever, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning every ridge. He seemed tireless, as though the mountain itself had made him out of stone and grit. By midday, the clouds had thickened, turning the world into a dull, colorless void. The path narrowed, until it was little more than a strip of rock, winding between cliffs that dropped into nothing. One wrong step, and that would be it. No grave, no cross, just a long fall into the cold. We stopped briefly in the lee of a boulder to eat what little we had left, a piece of dry bread and a few sips of water. Petro unrolled the burned map, tracing his finger along the line of ridges. "Here," he said, pointing to a narrow mark. "High pass. If we reach by tomorrow, we safe." I repeated, trying to believe it. He looked up, his eyes unreadable. "Maybe." That night, the storm hit. It came without warning, a rush of wind that howled down from the peaks, bringing with it a blinding wall of snow. Within minutes, the trail disappeared. We huddled against a rock face, our backs to the wind, our bodies shaking from the cold. "We can't stay here!" I shouted over the gale. Petro shook his head. "We move or die." So we moved. We climbed in the dark, snow swirling around us like smoke. The world shrank to the few feet ahead of my boots. My hands were numb, my face raw from the wind. More than once I stumbled, catching myself on the rock at the last second. At one point, Petro stopped suddenly and threw out his arm. "Listen!" I froze. Through the howl of the storm came another sound, faint but unmistakable. Voices, German. I pressed against the rocks, heart pounding. Flashlights flickered in the distance, cutting through the white. The bastards were up here too. "They follow tracks," Petro whispered. "They find Arben's camp." Oh, we go north. The realization hit like ice in my veins. Even after burning everything, they hadn't stopped. They were still hunting. Petro pointed toward a narrow crevice in the rock. There, hide. We squeezed inside just as the lights grew brighter. I could hear boots crunching on snow, the creak of weapons. Through a gap in the stone, I saw them. 6 soldiers, faces wrapped in scarves, rifles at the ready. Their breath steamed in the cold. One of them stopped, kneeling to study the snow. He said something to the others, too faint to catch, then pointed uphill. They started moving again, following our trail. Petro's jaw clenched. He looked at me, then at the path above. We go higher, lose them in storm. I nodded, though my body screamed in protest. We waited until the Germans disappeared into the blizzard, then crawled out of the crevice and began climbing again. Hours passed, maybe more. Time had no meaning anymore. Only the rhythm of breath, the crunch of snow, the endless grinding cold. When the wind finally eased, we found ourselves on a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was terrifying. Jagged peaks, black against a silver sky, and far below, a faint glimmer of campfires. German camps, most likely. The whole world below us was enemy territory. Petro sat beside me, breathing hard. Almost there, he said. High pass close. I nodded, but my vision was blurring. My body felt distant, as though it no longer belonged to me. I'd been running on fear and instinct for so long that exhaustion had become its own kind of numbness. We pushed on through the last stretch as dawn crept over the mountains. The snow had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight painted the peaks in pale gold. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think of was warmth, shelter, anything that didn't bite and freeze and hurt. When we finally reached the crest, Petro stopped and pointed. Below us in the distance, I saw it, a faint column of smoke rising from a narrow valley. A settlement, maybe a village. That's it? I asked, hardly daring to hope. He nodded. British camp near coast. We close now. I wanted to feel relief, but all I could feel was emptiness. Every friend I'd made in those mountains was gone. Every step had cost something. Petro clapped me on the back. You live American. Arbin proud. I smiled weakly. We're not there yet. And then, as if the mountain itself had heard me, a gunshot cracked through the air. The snow beside us exploded in a puff of white. Sniper! Petro yelled. We dropped flat as another shot rang out, echoing across the ridge. My heart slammed in my chest. The Germans hadn't given up. They were waiting for us at the pass. We were so close to freedom, and now we were trapped again. The shot came from nowhere, a single clean crack that split the mountain air. I didn't see the muzzle flash, didn't hear the bullet. I just felt it. The violent whip of air past my ear and the dull thud as it struck the rock behind me. Snow fell from the ledge in a whispering curtain. I dropped instantly, belly flat against the frozen stone. My heart was hammering so hard, it drowned out everything else. The pass stretched ahead, open, empty, a strip of white that led to the faint valley below. If I wanted to live, I'd have to cross it. If I moved, I'd die. The sniper had the perfect position. High ground, long range, full visibility. He could wait forever. I couldn't. I lay there for what felt like an hour, my body pressed against the ice, breath clouding the rock beneath me. The cold was burrowing in again, through the torn fabric, into the skin, down to the bone. My fingers were stiff, the pistol useless in my grip. I hadn't fired a weapon since the crash. I didn't even know if the damn thing would work. The wind shifted. Snow swept across the ridge, a blinding sheet that hid everything for a moment. I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3, then pushed forward, crawling on my elbows, inch by inch. My whole world shrank to the rhythm of my breath and the sting of snow in my eyes. A second shot, closer this time. The sound cracked the air beside my head, the bullet hissing past so close I could feel it. I froze. Silence again. then the faint echo rolling off the mountainside. He was playing with me. Somewhere out there, maybe 100 yards, maybe 500, was a man doing his job as perfectly as I was trying to survive mine. I pictured him in white camo, face hidden behind goggles, steady hands wrapped around the scope. I hated him, but I respected him too. He was good. Too good. The next gust of snow came harder, thicker. It cloaked the ridge completely. That was my chance. I forced myself up, crouched low, and ran. My boots slipped on the ice, my lungs burning as the air tore through them. Another shot rang out. Missed. I didn't look back. I just ran until the ridge curved, giving me a sliver of shelter behind the slab of granite. I fell hard against it, gasping, the cold stone pressing into my spine. My chest heaved. I'd made maybe 50 yards, half the distance to the drop. The snow eased. The world came back into view, gray and cruel. The pass stretched on, wide open again. And then I saw it. A glint of light, barely visible on the opposite slope. The sniper's scope. He'd found me. I flattened myself behind the rock. There was no way forward now. Going back meant death. The slope behind me was too steep to climb. I had to go through him. My pistol had 3 rounds left. 3 chances against a man I couldn't see. I waited. Minutes passed. The wind howled and faded again. My mind started drifting to Arbin, to the men at the fire, to the promise I'd made. I told them I'd make it out. I had to make it out. When the next gust rolled across the ridge, I moved. Not forward, down. I slid on my side, scraping across the rock into a narrow dip that cut below the sniper's line of sight. The world tilted, snow filling my mouth, my coat tearing open on a jagged edge. I didn't care. All that mattered was that I was lower now, hidden from view. The pass curved down into a shallow gully, half covered in drifts. I slid the rest of the way, half crawling, half falling, until the ground leveled. I could no longer see the sniper's perch, but that didn't mean he couldn't see me. I needed to move fast. The air smelled faintly of smoke, wood, not metal. Somewhere ahead, beyond the ridge, someone had lit a fire. A village, maybe, or one of the outposts Arbin had spoken of. I started running again. My legs didn't want to move, but fear did the work for them. Every step felt like a countdown. I expected the next bullet any second, but it didn't come. When I finally stumbled into the trees below the ridge, I collapsed. My whole body shook uncontrollably. My breath came in ragged bursts. I was still alive. Somehow I'd crossed. I stayed there for a long time. Lying in the snow, staring up at the gray sky, my mind was blank. The wind whispered through the branches, softer now, almost kind. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who still hunted me. But the worst was behind me, for the moment. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver medallion I'd taken from Arbin's camp. It had somehow survived everything. The fire, the storm, the fall. I turned it over in my hand and closed my fist around it. "I'm still here," I whispered. The mountains didn't answer. But for the first time, I believed it. The forest below the ridge was silent. The kind of silence that feels alive, like something's listening. I lay there for hours, letting my heart beat slow, the snow soaking through what was left of my clothes. The storm had passed, but the cold hadn't. My hands were blue at the fingertips, my breath shallow. Each exhale rose like smoke in the still air. When I finally pushed myself upright, the world seemed unreal. Too quiet, too empty. The trees were tall and skeletal, their branches heavy with frost. Somewhere far below, the valley stretched out, veiled in fog. I didn't know where I was, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to keep moving. Stopping meant dying, and I'd come too far for that. The first sound I heard was an engine. Low, distant, almost buried beneath the wind. I froze, crouched low, listening. It came again, deeper now, rhythmic. Trucks, several of them. I started toward the sound, keeping to the trees. Each step sank deep into the snow, each breath a cloud of mist. The forest thinned, and soon I saw it. A narrow road cutting through the valley, a column of German vehicles crawling along it like a metal snake. There must have been 10, maybe 12 trucks, a few motorcycles, and a half-track bringing up the rear. Soldiers in gray coats rode in the open backs, their rifles resting on their knees. Every few minutes, one of them would glance toward the woods, but never for long. They weren't expecting anyone out here. No one should have been alive this deep in the mountains. I watched them for a long time, hidden behind the roots of an old pine. My first instinct was to wait for them to pass and slip across the road once they were gone. But then I saw it, painted on the lead truck's door, faint under the dirt and snow, the black and white cross of a medical convoy. I didn't trust the Red Cross markings. The Germans used them often to disguise troop movements. But the idea hit me like a jolt of electricity. If I could get inside one of those trucks, I could ride it straight through the lines. They were heading east toward the coast, exactly where Arben had said the British operated. It was madness. I had no disguise, no weapon that would fool anyone, no plan beyond the first few minutes. But I'd been alone too long to turn back. I'd survived fire, cold, and hunger. Now it was time to gamble. As the convoy slowed to navigate a bend, I moved. I crawled through the snow, every movement deliberate, slow, controlled. The sound of the engines covered my noise, but not completely. I could hear the creak of boots on metal, the occasional bark of a voice. My pulse was so loud I thought they'd hear it. The last truck in the line carried crates, ammunition maybe, or rations. Its tarp flapped slightly in the wind. I waited until it passed, then lunged forward, catching the edge of the tailgate. My fingers slipped once, twice, then held. I hauled myself up, teeth clenched against the pain in my arms, and rolled under the canvas cover just as the truck began to pick up speed again. Inside it was dark and cold. The crates were stacked in rows, leaving narrow gaps between them. I wedged myself into one of the spaces and pulled the tarp down behind me. The smell of oil and wood filled the air. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. Minutes turned into hours. The road twisted endlessly, the rhythm of the engine almost hypnotic. Every so often, the truck would stop. Voices would shout orders, and boots would crunch on gravel nearby. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Once, a soldier lifted the tarp and peered inside. Light flooded the space, blinding. I pressed myself against the crates, praying he wouldn't look down. After a moment, he dropped the flap and walked away. When the truck started again, I let out the breath I'd been holding for nearly a minute. My whole body trembled. I was alive, still. Night fell. I could tell by the temperature, by the way the light faded through the cracks in the tarp. The convoy stopped more often now, sometimes for long stretches. I could hear laughter, clinking cups, the shuffle of cards. At some point, exhaustion overtook me. I drifted in and out of half sleep, the rumble of the engine beneath me like a heartbeat. My dreams were fevered. Arben's voice, Petro's eyes, the sound of the bomber's engines before it fell from the sky. When I woke, the truck was still. No engine noise, no voices, just wind. I waited, listening, nothing. Carefully, I lifted the tarp and peered out. The convoy was parked in what looked like an old farmyard. Half-collapsed barns, a few wooden fences, and a large brick building that might have once been a mill. Snow covered everything. I saw guards near the entrance, smoking, their rifles slung casually. Beyond them, down the slope was a faint glimmer. Lights, not campfires, electric. The coast. I was close now. I could feel it. The air smelled different. Damp, heavy, like salt and sea. I slipped from the truck when the guards turned away and crept toward the far side of the farm. Every sound felt like thunder in my ears. The crunch of snow, the creak of wood. I moved from shadow to shadow until I reached a broken wall overlooking the valley. Down there, in the distance, I saw it. The faint outline of ships against the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I saw home. But between me and that sea lay miles of occupied ground, watchtowers, and soldiers who'd shoot me before I could take another step. I'd made it out of the mountains. Now I had to cross a war. The coast looked close enough to touch, but that was a lie the night always told. I could see the faint glimmer of the water, the distant ships like ghosts moving along the horizon, Allied, maybe British. But between me and them stretched a valley alive with danger. German patrols, watchtowers, dogs, searchlights sweeping the snow. One wrong step and I would be a smear of red in the frost. I crouched behind the broken wall of the old farm, letting the sound of the wind cover my breathing. My body was failing. Hunger gnawed at me. My knees trembled with every movement, my fingers stiff and cracked from cold. But the thought of that water, of the freedom it promised, was enough to keep me upright. I'd come too far to die now. Below me, the German outpost pulsed with quiet activity. Trucks idled, their headlights dimmed under tarps. Soldiers walked between buildings with rifles slung loose over their shoulders, some laughing, others just shadows moving through the haze. From one of the barns came the faint hum of a generator and electricity, probably powering the radio tower near the edge of the compound. That tower was my problem. Its searchlight swept the fields rhythmically, crossing a stretch of open snow between the woods and the cliffs. Beyond those cliffs was the sea and freedom. But to reach it, I'd need to pass through the outpost undetected. I waited until the patrol near the road changed shift. 4 soldiers trudged off toward the main building, boots crunching, rifles hanging lazily. The others were huddled near a fire. That was my window. I moved from cover, sliding along the edge of the wall, then dropped low and crawled through the snow. Every sound was deafening. The hiss of frost under my coat, the faint jingle of my canteen. I stopped every few meters, listening for voices, waiting for the beam of light to pass overhead. The smell of diesel grew stronger as I neared the generator building. Its steady thrum filled the air. I peered through a crack in the wood. 2 mechanics inside, both half asleep on stools, cigarettes burning low. A radio crackled faintly beside them. German chatter, calm, routine. Nothing urgent. I spotted a line of uniforms hanging on a rack near the door. Greatcoats, spare gloves, helmets. For the first time, luck seemed to tilt my way. When one of the men stepped outside to relieve himself, I slipped through the open door. My movements were automatic, mechanical. Coat off, coat on, gloves, cap. The uniform hung loose, but in the dark it would do. I took a wrench from the workbench, tucking it into my belt like a weapon. The second mechanic stirred, his head lifted, eyes bleary. He said something, a question maybe, but I didn't stop to answer. I turned, pretending to check the fuel drums, muttered a vague "ja," and walked out before he could blink. Outside again, my heart thundered so loud it felt like it would give me away. But no one shouted. No alarm sounded. The uniform worked better than I dared hope. I walked with purpose now, back straight, the way every soldier moved when he didn't want to be questioned. I passed 2 guards near the radio tower. They nodded lazily and turned back to their cigarettes. I was close. The cliffs were only a few hundred meters away, just beyond a line of barbed wire and a small checkpoint. I could hear the ocean now. Faint, rhythmic, the sound of waves breaking against rock. Then came the barking. At first, I thought it was just another patrol dog, restless on its leash. But the sound grew sharper, angrier. The guards shouted. Flashlights cut through the dark. Someone had found the generator man. I ran. Not walking fast. Running, the way every instinct told me not to. Behind me, shouts erupted. Halt! A gun fired. The sound cracked across the night, echoing off the cliffs. I dove into the snow, rolling, the bullet hissing past my shoulder. I didn't stop. I tore through the drifts, crashing through a fence, the wood splintering against my side. My uniform snagged on the wire, ripping down the sleeve. Searchlights swept the field. blinding white arcs slicing through the night. I darted between them, sliding behind a storage shed as bullets ripped the snow beside me. My lungs burned like fire. The ocean was there. I could smell it, taste the salt in the wind. 50 meters. That's all that separated me from the edge. A spotlight hit me full in the face. Shouts again. I didn't look back. I ran until the ground fell away beneath me. The cliff's edge came too fast. I barely had time to brace before I was airborne. The world turned white, then black, then blue, cold water swallowing me whole. The shock of it was unbearable. Every muscle seized at once. I kicked, flailing, gasping for air that wasn't there. The current dragged me under, spun me sideways. My vision narrowed to nothing but the burn of salt and the pounding of my heart. Then I broke the surface, coughing, gasping. Above me, lights flared along the cliff, rifles flashing, tracer rounds zipping into the sea like red fireflies. None found me. The waves carried me farther out, into the darkness. Somewhere ahead, a shape moved through the fog. A small boat, engine idling low. I waved weakly, too tired to shout. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. Then came a voice, crisp and sharp through the spray. "Hold on, mate. We've got you." British. Strong hands hauled me aboard, rough voices shouting orders I could barely understand. A blanket wrapped around me, the sting of warmth and disbelief mixing in my chest. I'd done it. 17 days, no weapon, no hope. And yet, somehow, I'd made it. As the boat turned toward the open sea, I looked back once at the cliffs fading into the fog. Somewhere up there, the men who'd hunted me would be reporting a ghost. And maybe they were right. Because Harold Hayes, the man they thought they'd cornered and killed, was gone. Only the survivor remained. The deck of the British patrol boat was slick with salt and mist, the air thick with diesel and the rhythmic growl of the engine. I lay shivering under a coarse blanket, too weak to speak, too stunned to think. Every breath hurt. My fingers were raw, the skin split open from cold and frostbite. Yet all I could feel was the solid thrum of the vessel beneath me, proof that I was alive, that I had somehow crossed through hell and come out the other side. The sailors spoke quickly around me, voices clipped and urgent, English cutting through the storm like music. One of them knelt beside me, a young man with oil-stained hands and the accent of Portsmouth. "Easy now," he said, pressing a flask to my lips. "You're safe. You're bloody safe, mate." I tried to answer, but my throat only rasped. He caught my arm, the one still wrapped in a torn German sleeve, and frowned. "Where the devil have you come from?" I wanted to tell him everything, the crash, the mountains, the snow, Arbin's fire, the sniper, the convoy. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I whispered the only thing that mattered. Allied pilot. That was enough. Within minutes, they had me below deck, wrapped in dry clothes, a medic checking my pulse with disbelief. I heard one of them murmur, 17 days out here? Impossible. Impossible. That word would follow me everywhere. By dawn, the boat reached a larger ship, an escort destroyer flying the white ensign. They winched me aboard like cargo, and I was met by an officer whose face was carved from suspicion and duty. Commander's bars, sharp eyes. He didn't smile. "Name and rank." "Flight Officer Harold Hayes, Royal Air Force." My voice cracked, but the words felt good, solid mine. He exchanged a glance with the medic, then gestured toward a steel door. Inside, the room smelled of paper and tobacco. A small office built for questioning. I sat opposite him, still wrapped in the blanket, trembling despite the heat. "You were reported missing after your squadron went down over the Albanian coast," he said, flipping through a file. "No survivors were found." "That was over 2 weeks ago." I know, I whispered. I was there. His eyes lifted, measuring me. And yet here you are. I nodded slowly. Here I am. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Explain how. So I did. I told him everything, from the bomber's death spiral into the mountains to crawling through snow with nothing but frostbitten hands and a dead man's coat. I told him about Arbin, the resistance fighter who shared his fire and his bread, about the sniper who hunted me across the ridge, about the convoy I'd hidden inside, the uniforms, the bullets, the fall into the sea. When I finished, the room was quiet. The commander didn't write anything down. He just stared at me like a man looking at a ghost. Do you expect me to believe, he said finally, that you survived 17 days behind German lines, unarmed, and escaped by leaping off a cliff into the bloody Adriatic? Yes, sir, I said simply, because that's what happened. He studied me for a long time, then sighed, rubbing his temples. You realize how this sounds? Like a miracle, I answered. And maybe it was. That earned me the faintest smirk. Miracles aren't in my job description, flight officer, but surviving is. He leaned back, folded his arms, and nodded toward the door. You'll be debriefed in Malta. Until then, rest. You look half dead. He wasn't wrong. They gave me a bunk and broth that tasted like heaven. For the first time in weeks, I slept, really slept, for more than an hour. No wind, no gunfire, no sound but the hum of engines carrying me home. When I woke, I found the young sailor from before sitting nearby, cleaning his rifle. He grinned. Thought you were a ghost, mate. Captain didn't believe a word of it till they checked your tag. Do they believe it now? I asked. He shrugged. Doesn't matter, does it? You're here, that's what counts. But I knew it did matter. Somewhere out there, the story of what happened, the real story, would be filed away, edited, lost beneath 1,000 reports. The men I'd left behind, Arbin and his people, their bravery, their fire, none of it would make the papers. When we reached Malta, intelligence officers took me aside again. More questions, more disbelief. They examined my uniform, the German coat, the map I'd scrawled on the inside lining. They called it remarkable, unlikely, difficult to verify. One of them even suggested I'd been captured and somehow released, as if the Germans had simply let me go. In the end, they stamped the report, closed the file, and sent me to London for recovery. Weeks later, when I stood on British soil again, the city felt unreal. Crowds, lights, the sound of trains, all of it strange after the silence of the mountains. No one recognized me when I walked into my old squadron's office. They thought I was dead. My name was carved into a memorial board. I stared at it for a long time before anyone realized who I was. Christ almighty, one of the mechanics whispered. It's Hayes. It's Bloody Harold. The room went silent. Then someone laughed, half disbelief, half joy. I smiled back, though I didn't feel alive yet. Part of me was still in the snow, still crawling beneath that searchlight, still hearing Arbin's voice whispering, keep moving. I never told them everything. Some things belong to the mountains, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind blew through the airfield and the cold bit at my hands, I could still feel that ridge under my palms, still taste the frost in the air, still hear the echo of my own heart reminding me I wasn't supposed to survive. And yet I did. When the war ended, the noise stopped, but inside me it never did. The sound of engines and wind, the echo of boots on frozen ground, the whisper of snow against stone. They all stayed, circling in the corners of my mind. London was alive with celebration. The streets bright and loud, but I felt like a shadow moving through it. I was 26, thinner than I'd ever been, with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts. The RAF gave me leave, a desk, and eventually a discharge. I didn't argue. They called me a miracle, a survivor, a man who'd beaten death, but I knew better. Death just hadn't had the patience for me. The reports wrote themselves without me, words like unlikely and unverified, and account incomplete, appearing again and again. My story turned into a rumor before I even had the chance to tell it. Journalists asked for interviews at first, but when I refused to make it sound heroic, they stopped asking. There was nothing romantic about frostbite, starvation, and silence. There was nothing cinematic about the sound of your own heartbeat in the dark. So I disappeared. I found work as a mechanic in Sussex, the kind of job where no one asked questions and no one cared who you'd been before the war. The smell of oil and steel was familiar, almost comforting. I could lose myself in engines and rhythm and work. The days blurred into months, the months into years. I married once, a nurse I'd met during rehabilitation, but even she couldn't live with the quiet that followed me. She said I looked through her sometimes like I was watching something far away. She wasn't wrong. We parted kindly, with no anger. She deserved someone who lived in the present, not a man forever walking out of the snow. I never blamed her. I didn't blame anyone. The government never declassified most of my file. Some said it was because of the resistance contact. Others because they couldn't prove half of what I claimed. It didn't matter to me. I didn't need a record. The mountains had already written my truth in scars across my hands and the way my body flinched whenever the wind turned cold. For decades, I stayed silent. Men from the war would gather and talk about the great battles, the aircraft, the missions. I went once, just once, to a reunion in London. A group of old pilots raised their glasses to the ones who didn't make it. I stood there smiling and realized that, in their minds, I was supposed to be one of them, dead. My name was still carved in stone somewhere, and a memorial to a man who no longer existed. I left before dessert. Life after that was simple. Work, walk, sleep. Sometimes when the winter came and the first snow fell, I'd wake before dawn and stand outside barefoot just to feel the sting again, to remind myself that I had lived through worse. The neighbors thought I was eccentric, a relic of another time. Maybe I was. Years passed. My hair went gray, my back bent, and the world moved on to new wars, new stories. Mine was buried, forgotten except for the faint whisper of old intelligence records and the curiosity of historians who loved unsolved riddles. It wasn't until the 1980s, long after I'd retired, that a young archivist from the RAF museum knocked on my door. She had a file under her arm, one marked dated Missing F.O. Harold Hayes. She'd found it buried in a crate of declassified documents. She wanted to know if the story was true. I remember her face when I opened the door. Shock first, then disbelief, then quiet wonder. "You're him," she said softly. "You're supposed to be dead." I laughed for the first time in months. I was supposed to be, yes, I told her. She asked if she could interview me, record it properly, but I refused. Some things belonged to the silence that saved me. Instead, I gave her the medallion I'd kept since Albania. Arbin's medallion, the one that had survived fire and frost and ocean. "This," I said, "is all the proof I need." She looked at it for a long time before nodding. I never saw her again, but a year later, a small article appeared in an RAF Veterans Journal. One paragraph about a pilot who survived 17 days behind enemy lines without firing a shot. No name, no picture, just the story. That was enough. I wasn't looking for glory. I'd had enough of the world's noise. I lived out my last years by the coast, not far from the same sea that had carried me home. On calm mornings, I'd sit on the pier with my tea and watch the horizon fade into gray. Sometimes, if the light hit the water just right, I could almost see the cliffs again, white and cruel and beautiful. I'd close my eyes and hear the wind, the engines, the distant echo of my own heartbeat, reminding me of the truth no report could ever capture. I had survived not because I was brave, not because I was lucky, but because something deep inside refused to stop moving forward. And that, in the end, was all survival ever was. The stubborn defiance of a man who simply refused to die. They called me the ghost pilot, in whispers long after I was gone, or at least that's what I later heard. I suppose it was fitting. I had vanished into snow and silence, into history's blind spot. My service record ended abruptly in 1944. My death certificate was signed 2 weeks later. The file should have stayed closed forever. One more name among the lost. But history has a way of tripping over its own ghosts. And one winter's day, 40 years after the war, mine came back to haunt them. It began with that same young archivist, Sarah Templeton, though I didn't know her name then. She'd gone digging through forgotten storage rooms in Hendon, looking for misplaced intelligence reports. When she stumbled on my file, brittle pages, typewriter ink fading to gray, stamped MIA, presumed killed. There were notes in the margins. Rumored survivor, sighting near coast, unverified. Nothing more. Just fragments. She should have closed the box and moved on, but she didn't. Something in that word, unverified, must have caught her curiosity. She wrote letters, checked records, followed the trail of paperwork that led nowhere, until one name appeared, again and again. A mechanic in Sussex who'd quietly retired decades earlier, known for his quiet manners, his limp, and his refusal to talk about the war. That was me. I didn't know she'd been looking for me until she arrived at my door that spring afternoon, hair windswept, cheeks flushed, clutching the past like it might dissolve in her hands. When she said my name, I almost denied it. For a moment, it felt like the mountains were reaching out for me again, trying to pull me back. "Mr. Hayes," she said, breathless, "I think you're the man from this file." I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. I just stared at the old RAF stamp, at the words that had defined me for 40 years. Missing in action. Missing, not dead, not alive, just missing. "I used to be," I said finally. "Not anymore." She smiled, but her eyes softened. "I've been reading about the Albanian campaign. If your story's true, sir, it deserves to be told." That word again, true. I'd heard it 100 times before, always as a challenge. She didn't mean it that way. Her voice held something gentler. Belief, maybe. Or hope. She stayed that afternoon asking questions while I poured tea, my hands trembling more than I liked. I told her pieces, never the whole thing. She didn't press. Maybe she sensed that the parts I didn't share were the ones that still hurt to touch. When she left, she asked to keep the medallion. I hesitated, but handed it over. It belonged to the dead, not to me. She promised she'd look after it. For a long time, I thought that was the end of it. But Sarah didn't stop there. She found the old naval log from the destroyer that had rescued me, cross-referenced the patrol routes, the weather conditions, even the fuel records. Piece by piece, she rebuilt the trail, the crash, the trek, the escape. Her report went to the RAF Museum, and for the first time in half a century, my story found its way into the archives again, this time under a different heading, Confirmed Survivor. I didn't live to see it, not really. By the time it went public, my name had already been carved into another stone, the one in the churchyard by the sea. But people began to talk. They dug through the history books, searching for the man who had lived 17 days behind enemy lines without firing a shot. Veterans recognized the tale from whispers long ago. A few remembered hearing about a pilot who fell from the sky and simply refused to die. And then something unexpected happened. The story spread. Not through official channels, but through word of mouth. From one old soldier to another, from teachers to students, from sons to fathers. They said I represented something simple but forgotten. Endurance without glory, courage without witness. I was a ghost who'd walked through hell and come back not to fight, but to remember. And maybe that was enough. Even now, I imagine Sarah standing in front of that display case in Hendon, the medallion resting under glass beside a photograph of a young man in a flight jacket, the caption reading, Flight Officer Harold Hayes, presumed dead 1944, returned 1945. Survivor, no fanfare, no medals, no speeches, just a story reclaimed from silence. The ghost had a name again. And in the quiet of the archives, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, the snow began to fall once more, not outside, but in memory, where it had always lived. Even after all those years, the snow never left me. It clung to my dreams, to the stillness of early mornings, to the quiet moments when the world forgot to make noise. I would wake sometimes before dawn, the light just beginning to stretch across the horizon, and for a heartbeat, I wouldn't know where I was. The sound of the wind against my window would become the mountains again. That hollow, whistling breath of ice moving through stone. And then I'd remember. I wasn't there anymore. But some part of me still was. The mind never fully escapes the places it almost died. The snow had become part of me, as constant as blood. After Sarah's visit, I started walking again. Long, slow walks along the cliffs near my home. The sea air burned my lungs, but I liked it that way. It reminded me I was alive. The gulls screamed overhead. The waves crashed below, and in the sound I could hear the echo of my own heartbeat, the same rhythm that had carried me through those 17 days. People in the village began to recognize me. The old man with the limp, always staring at the sea. A few locals knew my story from the paper, though most thought it was legend. They'd nod politely, whisper when they passed. Some asked questions, and I'd smile and shake my head. It's all in the archives, I'd say, though I knew the archives told only half of it. The rest was buried in the snow. I remember one boy, couldn't have been more than 12, who stopped me one morning as I watched the horizon. He had that look of wide-eyed curiosity only children have. Sir, he said, is it true you walked all the way through enemy lines without a gun? I looked down at him and thought of the men I'd met who hadn't made it. Arbin, the mechanic, the nameless sniper whose bullet had missed by inches. Something like that, I told him, but it wasn't walking that saved me. He frowned. Then what did? I thought for a moment, the cold wind biting my face. Not stopping, I said finally. That's all survival ever is. You just don't stop. He didn't fully understand, but he smiled anyway. He'd understand one day when life got hard enough to demand it. That boy reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that stories aren't meant to glorify suffering, they're meant to pass on endurance. I hadn't fought a battle with guns or glory. I'd fought one with silence and cold and fear, and maybe that's what made it worth remembering. As the years went by, I stopped dreaming of the fire and the fall. The mountains faded into a kind of peace in my memory. I could think of them now without my chest tightening, without tasting blood and frost. Sometimes I even felt grateful, as strange as that sounds. The snow had stripped me bare, taken everything I thought I needed and left behind something harder, simpler, truer. The man who had fallen into that ridge in 1944 had died there. The one who walked out was someone else entirely. There were moments, though, when the past returned without warning. A certain smell, the way sunlight hit the frost on a car's windshield, the echo of boots on cobblestones. The body remembers what the mind forgets. But those moments no longer frightened me. They reminded me that the line between life and death, between presence and absence, is thinner than we think. I had crossed that line and come back. The least I could do was honor it by living quietly, deliberately, without complaint. One winter morning, it must have been 1989 or 1990, I woke to find the first snow of the year falling over the cliffs. Thick, slow flakes drifting in silence. I stepped outside and let them land on my hands, my face, my hair. For the first time, the cold didn't hurt. It felt gentle, like an old friend. I stood there for a long time, breathing it in. The boy I'd once been would have seen it as a challenge, another test of endurance. The man I'd become saw it for what it truly was, peace. I knew my time was running short. My body was failing, though my will still burned. But as I watched the snow cover the ground, I felt no fear. I had walked through worse storms and found my way home. When I finally went inside, I sat by the fire, closed my eyes, and listened to the wind moving through the eaves. It didn't sound like the mountains anymore. It sounded like rest. And I remember thinking, before sleep took me, if there's anything left of me after this, if memory has any mercy, I hope it finds peace not in the noise of war, but in the quiet of falling snow. Because that's where I truly lived. Not in the glory, not in the reports, but in the silence between heartbeats, where a man learns what he's really made of. That was my final victory. Not survival, not recognition, but the understanding that life, no matter how fragile, is enough. And if the snow takes me again, let it. This time I won't fight it. I never knew what became of my story after I was gone, at least not in the way the living do, but if there's something beyond the breath, beyond the cold and the ache of the world, then maybe consciousness lingers, quietly watching the ripples left behind. I think I felt it, that faint stirring of memory somewhere in the folds of time, as if the world was exhaling my name after holding it for too long. It began in the smallest of ways, not with newspapers or history books, but with the sound of footsteps in the museum. Curious visitors, children with questions, veterans standing still before the display case that bore my photograph. They would stare for a long time, longer than most. I could feel their thoughts, the way they tried to imagine what those 17 days had been like, what it must have felt like to walk through hell without a weapon, without hope, and yet keep walking. Some said prayers under their breath. Others just nodded as if recognizing an old pain they'd buried themselves. There's something strange about being remembered when you're no longer there to correct the story. I had lived a life of silence, yet the silence had become the loudest part of me. Sarah had done what I never could. She'd spoken for me. She'd pieced together the fragments I'd left scattered in the snow, and somehow they'd formed a whole. But stories have lives of their own. They grow, they shift, they take on the shape of those who tell them. I could feel mine stretching, evolving, turning into something larger, not false, not exactly, but heavier with meaning than I ever intended. They said I had survived through courage, through sheer willpower. Perhaps that was true. But what they didn't see was the fear, the hunger, the unbearable loneliness. Survival isn't born of courage. It's born of refusal. The refusal to let go, even when every cell in your body begs you to. I began to sense my name again, whispered in classrooms, written in books, retold by historians who'd never felt snow burning against their skin. They spoke of Flight Officer Harold Hayes as though he were a symbol. Resilience, endurance, the indomitable spirit of wartime humanity. I wasn't sure I deserved those words. I had stumbled, crawled, and nearly died a dozen times over, and none of it had felt noble. But maybe that was the point. Maybe survival's truth lies not in heroism, but in the quiet act of enduring. The students who read about me would never know the smell of burnt fuel, the taste of thawed snow on the tongue, the sound of your heartbeat echoing in the dark. But if my story could make them pause, just for a moment, and understand that strength isn't loud, that it often comes dressed in exhaustion and fear, then perhaps that was enough. I used to wonder what would become of the world we fought for. Decades had passed, nations rebuilt, wars began and ended again. People moved on, as they always do. But some part of me was still there, not in stone or ink, but in the spaces between, in the hush of remembrance ceremonies, in the breath caught in a veteran's throat, in the soft rustle of poppies pinned to coats. I existed not as a man anymore, but as an echo of endurance, and there was peace in that. Sometimes I felt Sarah again, older, slower, but still driven by that same gentle fire. She would visit the museum on quiet afternoons and in before my display as the sun angled through the high windows. She would whisper something, though I could never quite hear it. Maybe she was thanking me. Maybe she was saying goodbye. She grew frail with time, her hands trembling as she traced the edge of the medallion beneath the glass. Before she died, she left a letter with the curators. It said only this: he walked through 17 days of silence and came back not to speak, but to remind us that silence is not the same as surrender. That line found its way everywhere. In books, on plaques. Even in a documentary years later, people quoted it as though it were mine, though it had always belonged to her. Still, I didn't mind. She had understood something essential about me, that I had never sought to be remembered. I had only wanted to live quietly after so much noise. There were moments, rare but unmistakable, when I felt something like warmth, as though the world was folding me back into itself. Perhaps memory is the closest thing to immortality we ever get. Not the memory of glory or deeds, but of being seen, even once, for who we truly were. Somewhere, a teacher tells my story to a classroom full of children who barely understand what war means. A boy looks at my photograph and then wonders what it would feel like to face that kind of cold. A man visits the museum and finds himself unexpectedly crying. Each of them carries a piece of me forward. Not the soldier, the human being who refused to die in silence. If I could speak to them now, I wouldn't tell them about the snow or the hunger. I'd tell them this: survival is not victory, but it is grace. It's the proof that even in the darkest winters, something in us still reaches for the light. And perhaps that's all we are ever meant to do. Time is a strange thing when you no longer feel its pull. It stretches and folds, loops back on itself. And in that looping, I began to see how small moments ripple outward long after we're gone. I had thought my life ended on that ridge, then again in that small house by the sea. But memory has its own current, and somehow it carried me onward. Not in body, but in story. I could see it moving through the years like smoke, quiet but persistent. My name, my 17 days, my silence, they became threads woven into the fabric of remembrance. Not grand, not loud, but steady, like a heartbeat echoing beneath history's noise. I watched classrooms change, the chalkboards replaced by screens, the uniforms replaced by sneakers. The world I'd left behind had grown faster, louder, more restless. Yet still, on certain mornings in November, they stood in silence. The bugle played, the air held still, and I could feel it. That hush before the sound. The collective breath of a people remembering. Somewhere among them, a teacher would mention my name. A few students would look up, curious. One might even stay behind after class to read more. That's how memory survived. Not through monuments, but through curiosity. Through the simple act of someone wanting to know. One winter, decades after Sarah's passing, a young filmmaker found her letter. He was researching forgotten stories of the war. The quiet ones, the unsung. When he came across mine, he said later it felt different. Not a tale of victory or defeat, but of endurance. He made a documentary, nothing grand, filmed with reverence rather than spectacle. My voice was read by an actor, quiet and deliberate, and the mountains were rendered in grayscale. Snow fell without sound. When it aired, people wept, not because of tragedy, but because of recognition. They saw something human in it, something that belonged not to the past, but to them. It struck me then how little control we have over what we leave behind. I had spent my life believing my story had ended in obscurity, but obscurity is only the absence of light, not the absence of meaning. The world eventually turns, and light finds even the smallest corners. I began to feel myself spread out, in the quiet rooms where veterans gathered, in the tremor of old hands holding photographs, in the eyes of children hearing about courage for the first time. My 17 days no longer belonged to me. They belonged to anyone who had ever been afraid and kept walking anyway. Sometimes I'd drift, pulled toward those who carried my name in their thoughts. One young woman, a historian years after the film, wrote her dissertation on the psychology of survival, the Hayes phenomenon. She'd never met me, but she understood something most never did. She wrote that survival isn't about strength or bravery. It's about acceptance. The acceptance that fear will come, that pain will follow, and that you keep moving anyway. Reading her words, or rather, feeling them, I realized she was right. The secret of endurance was never about fighting the cold, it was about walking with it. The more the world changed, the more my story did too. It became less about a man and more about an idea. That sometimes the greatest acts of defiance are the quietest ones. People began using my name in metaphors. The Hayes Resolve, they called it in lectures about resilience. Companies used it in training materials, soldiers in their briefings. I became an example, a parable, an echo that refused to fade. And though it should have felt strange, it didn't. Because somewhere in all of that, the truth still remained. Not the facts, not the details, but the feeling. The cold. The will, the silence. I often thought of Sarah and how her belief had reignited all this. I hope she could see it now. How the small act of caring enough to uncover a forgotten file had lit a fuse that burned for generations. Her persistence had given me a second life, one not measured in years, but in remembrance. I wondered if that's all legacy really is. Not glory, not fame, but being carried forward in quiet hearts who refuse to forget. When I look at the world now, this strange, bright, restless world, I don't see war the way I once did. I see humanity's endless attempt to make sense of its own pain. I see people telling stories not to relive the suffering, but to remind themselves that even in the darkest winters, someone kept walking. And in that, there's something sacred. I was once just a name typed on yellowing paper, a man presumed dead in a forgotten corner of Europe. But through time and memory, I became something else, proof that silence can speak, that loss can teach, and that survival, no matter how small, matters. Perhaps one day even my name will fade completely, lost to the years. But it doesn't matter anymore. Because the snow still falls, the stories are still told, and somewhere, someone is listening. Not to the man, but to the echo of what he endured. And that, I think, is enough. Harold Hayes became more than a soldier who survived. He became a testament to what quiet endurance truly means. Long after the guns of World War II fell silent, his story continued to echo through generations. Not for his victories in battle, but for his unwavering will to survive 17 days behind enemy lines without a weapon, without support, and without surrender. Historians would later call him one of the forgotten heroes of the war, a man whose courage wasn't forged in the heat of combat, but in the frozen silence of isolation. Hayes embodied the kind of strength that goes unseen, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't boast, but simply endures. He was the embodiment of what so many soldiers fought for, the will to keep moving forward, even when the world around them was falling apart. His rediscovery decades later by archivist Sarah Templeton reignited an interest in the lesser-known stories of World War II, the ones lived not in the glare of heroism, but in the shadows of survival. Through her persistence, Hayes's journey was verified and shared with the world. His name was added to museum archives, his story taught in classrooms, and his endurance celebrated as an example of humanity at its most fragile and most powerful. Today, Harold Hayes is remembered not only as a pilot who vanished and returned, but as a man who carried the weight of silence with dignity. He is revered among historians and veterans alike for representing the countless others who never made it home, for giving a face and a name to the resilience that defined a generation. His story reminds us that heroism doesn't always take the form of victory. Sometimes it lies simply in survival, Visitors who stand before his display at the Royal Air Force Museum often describe a sense of calm, of reflection. His photograph, a young man with tired eyes and a faint, steady expression, seems to look back at them as if to say, "You would have done the same." For many, Hayes's story has become a quiet symbol of endurance, a reminder that even in the coldest, most desperate moments, the human spirit can endure unimaginable trials. In the years since his rediscovery, documentaries, articles, and books have retold his journey, each finding new meaning in his silence. Soldiers and civilians alike have found inspiration in his endurance. His story is studied not just as history, but as philosophy. The idea that resilience is not about conquering fear, but coexisting with it. That strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through frozen breath in the dark. Harold Hayes's life stands as a testament to all who have faced impossible odds and kept moving. His 63 behind enemy lines are more than a wartime account. They are a reflection of what it means to be human, to struggle, to survive, and to be remembered not for glory, but for perseverance. He never sought fame, and perhaps that's what makes his story so powerful. In his humility lies his greatness. Harold Hayes is remembered not as a man who fought, but as one who endured, and in doing so became eternal. Disclaimer: this video is for storytelling and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a definitive historical account, and some details may be dramatized or fictionalized for narrative effect.